If you had 30 nights to sell your freedom, would you still recognize yourself on the 31st? The foreclosure notice was nailed to Claire Bennett's front door before dawn, the paper snapping in the January wind, as if impatient to strip her of everything. Inside the 600-square-foot house on Maple Street, her 12-year-old sister coughed beneath a thin quilt, the heater long silent because there was no money left for oil, and Claire stood very still, staring at the bold numbers, $50, 000 due in 30 days. Knowing that 30 days was a mercy she did not have, by noon she had wrapped her wool coat tight and boarded the last bus out of town, snow swallowing the highway mile after mile until Whitmore Manor rose from the white hills like something carved from winter itself. Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, did not rise when she was shown into his study. He merely watched her from behind a mahogany desk, gray eyes steady, unreadable, as the firelight traced the hard line of his jaw. "You came about the debt," he said, not as a question but a conclusion, and Claire forced her shaking hands to still. "My sister is sick," she replied, lifting her chin because dignity was the only thing she had not yet sold. He studied her a long moment, then stood, tall enough that the room seemed to adjust around him, and crossed to the window where snow fell in thick, relentless sheets. "You will be mine for 30 nights, he said quietly, the words landing heavier than any shout. 30 nights under this roof, by my rules, and the debt disappears. Your home remains. Yours. Your sister receives the best doctor within 100 miles. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. She had expected refusal, perhaps humiliation, not a bargain that sounded almost merciful and yet carried a cost she could not measure. "And after 30 nights?" she asked. He did not turn. "You walk away, and you never speak of what occurred here." The clock on the mantel ticked, each second a hammer. She imagined Emily's thin shoulders, the way she tried not to cough so it wouldn't worry her, and Claire understood that some choices are not choices at all. "I accept," she said, "because survival sometimes wears the face of surrender." That evening, as the storm sealed the manor from the world, Claire was shown to a room in the East Wing, warm and lit by a single lamp, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to breathe. But when the door opened precisely at 10 and a footman announced that His Grace awaited her, her heartbeat returned in sharp, deliberate strikes. She walked the long corridor alone, aware of every step, every shadow. And when she entered the Duke's chamber, she found him not waiting in darkness, but seated by the fire with a leather folder in his hands. "These are the medical arrangements for your sister," he said, offering the papers instead of reaching for her. "The doctor leaves within the hour." Claire stared at him, confusion flickering through fear. This was not what she had imagined. "You said I would be yours," she whispered. His gaze lifted to hers, something almost human beneath the frost. "For 30 nights, he replied. "You will sit with me, dine with me, speak honestly with me. No lies, no masks. That is the rule." Outside, the wind howled against the stone walls, but inside, something else shifted, something neither of them yet understood. The first night had begun, and destiny had quietly stepped into the room. The second night began with a silence so complete that Claire could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace from the opposite end of the East Wing. She had expected summons at the same precise hour, but when the clock struck 10 and no footman arrived, uncertainty crept beneath her ribs like cold air under a door. She stood by the tall window of her room, watching snow drift across the darkened courtyard, wondering if the Duke had already grown bored of his own arrangement. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and when she opened the door, she found not a servant but Alexander Whitmore himself standing in the corridor, coat draped over his arm, expression composed yet unreadable. "Walk with me," he said, and though his tone was even, it carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Claire followed him through corridors lit by low amber lamps, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to measure her worth. They descended a narrow staircase that led not to a ballroom or study, but to a glass conservatory at the rear of the manor, where winter roses slept beneath panes frosted white. The air inside was warmer, touched by the scent of soil and something faintly floral. "No one comes here after midnight," he said, moving toward a wooden bench near the center. Claire remained standing, Is this part of your rules? She asked carefully. He regarded her for a long moment before answering. Honesty is, he said. Tell me what you thought would happen when you agreed to stay. The question unsettled her more than any command could have. She had prepared herself for humiliation, for the quiet erosion of pride, but not for conversation that asked her to reveal the truth. I thought I would endure, she replied at last. 30 nights can be survived if there is something waiting at the end. His gaze sharpened slightly. And what waits at the end? My sister breathing without pain, Claire answered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. A shadow crossed his expression, so fleeting she almost imagined it. He stepped closer, not invading her space, but narrowing the distance enough that she could see the faint line of exhaustion beneath his eyes. You assume I am your adversary, he said quietly. I am not the one who failed you before you walked through my door. Claire swallowed. No, Your Grace. But you are the one who named a price. The words hung between them, fragile but unbroken. Instead of anger, something like respect flickered in his features. He gestured toward the bench. Sit, she did, though her posture remained upright, cautious. For a few moments they listened to the wind pressing against the glass. The doctor arrived at your house an hour ago, he said finally. He will remain there as long as necessary. Claire's breath caught. Relief threatened to undo her composure, but she forced herself to remain still. Thank you, she whispered. He inclined his head slightly, as if gratitude were unfamiliar terrain. This arrangement was never intended to harm you. He continued. It is a test. Of what? She asked. He looked out. Across the sleeping roses. Of whether something genuine can exist where obligation once stood. Claire felt her heartbeat shift, not slower, not faster, but deeper. She had entered this manor prepared to barter pieces of herself. Instead, she was being asked to reveal who she truly was. The second night did not end with a command or a dismissal. It ended with a question in his eyes that neither of them dared to answer. And as Claire returned to her room, she understood that survival might not be the only thing at stake anymore. By the third night, Claire understood that silence inside Whitmore Manor carried its own kind of pressure. It pressed gently but persistently, like snow gathering inch by inch against a closed door. She had spent the day in the East Wing library, a vast room lined with dark oak shelves and tall windows overlooking fields buried under nearly 2 feet of winter. The staff treated her with careful neutrality, neither warmth nor disdain, as though they were waiting to see what shape she would take. In this house, when evening arrived, she did not wait for a summons. At precisely 10 o'clock she walked to the conservatory on her own, unsure whether she would find him there. Alexander Whitmore stood near the glass wall, coat discarded, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, studying the frost that traced delicate patterns across the panes. He did not turn when she entered. You came without being called, he said, his voice low but not displeased. I assumed honesty includes initiative, she replied. A faint breath of amusement escaped him, barely visible in the air between them. Then tell me something honest, he said, finally facing her. The fire from a small iron heater cast shifting light across his features, softening the severity that daylight seemed to carve into stone. Claire hesitated only a moment. I do not understand why a man with this much power would need a bargain to feel something real. The words were bold, perhaps reckless, but they did not feel wrong. His jaw tightened, not in anger but in recognition. Power does not purchase loyalty, he said quietly. It purchases compliance. He stepped closer, the space between them narrowing but never threatening. And compliance grows tiresome. Claire searched his face, seeing not cruelty but fatigue, the kind that lingers long after sleep. So this is an experiment, she said, to see if someone will stay when they are free to leave. You are not free, he reminded her, though the words lacked their earlier edge. She lifted her chin. I am free in one way that matters. You cannot force me to respect you. Something shifted in his expression at that, something almost startled. Outside, the wind rattled the glass, but neither of them looked away. My family built this estate a century ago, he said after a long pause. They believed legacy was measured in land and titles. I am beginning to suspect it is measured in something far more fragile. Claire felt her heartbeat steady rather than race. Then perhaps you chose the wrong currency, she said softly. He studied her as though seeing her fully for the first time, not as a debtor or a condition, but as a person who dared to challenge him. Most people speak carefully around me, he observed. Most people are not asked to trade 30 nights for survival, she answered. The truth settled between them without bitterness. For a moment the air seemed lighter, as if the frost on the glass had thinned. He moved to a small table and poured 2 cups of tea, offering one without ceremony. Sit, he said. She did. They spoke then of ordinary things, of the town she grew up in, of the way the river froze solid enough for trucks to cross in. February, of the first snowfall she remembered as a child. He listened without interruption, absorbing each detail as though it were a language he had nearly forgotten. When the clock struck 11, he rose. That is enough for tonight, he said. No demand, no dismissal, simply a boundary honored. As Claire walked back through the corridor, she realized that the third night had not weakened her. It had revealed something else entirely. This house was not testing her endurance. It was testing his. On the fourth night, the snow finally stopped, leaving the world outside Whitmore Manor buried in a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if winter itself were holding its breath. Claire spent the afternoon in the west corridor overlooking the frozen lake, watching sunlight fracture across the ice in pale silver lines that stretched nearly a mile to the tree-line. She had received a brief message from the doctor confirming that Emily's fever had broken, and the relief still lingered in her chest like warmth from a distant fire. When evening arrived, she found Alexander already waiting in the conservatory, not standing this time, but seated at a small iron table scattered with old letters bound in faded ribbon. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment there was no calculation in his gaze, only something quieter, almost uncertain. You said legacy is fragile, Claire began, removing her gloves slowly. What broke yours? The question was gentle, but it did not retreat. He studied her as if deciding whether the answer was worth the risk. Finally, he untied the ribbon around the letters and slid one across the table. My father believed that control was the only form of strength, he said. He measured loyalty in obedience and affection in silence. Claire read only a few lines before understanding that the handwriting belonged to a woman who had once lived inside these walls but had never truly been seen. Your mother, she said softly. He inclined his head. She left when I was 16, not because she lacked courage, but because she refused to become invisible. The admission hung in the warm air between them. Claire felt the weight of it, not as gossip, but as confession. And you think you are becoming him, she said. It was not accusation. It was recognition. He did not deny it. Instead, he rose and walked to the glass wall, hands resting lightly against the frame. When you have inherited power, he said quietly, you must decide whether to repeat it or redefine it. Claire joined him, standing at a respectful distance, watching their faint reflections in the glass layered over the frozen world beyond. Then why 30 nights? She asked. His reflection met hers before he turned to face her directly. Because I needed a boundary, he said. Something finite. Something that would prevent me from confusing attachment with obligation. Claire felt the truth of it settle. He was not testing her devotion. He was testing his own capacity to feel without possession. And what if attachment cannot be scheduled? She asked. A faint curve touched his mouth. Not quite a smile, but no longer guarded. Then I will have miscalculated. There was no arrogance in the statement, only quiet acknowledgement of risk. The heater hummed softly. Behind them, the roses beneath the glass remained dormant, waiting for a season that felt impossibly far away. Claire folded her hands before her, steady and composed. You are not your father, she said. You are a man who made a choice to offer help instead of withholding it. That already changes the measure. He held her gaze, and for the first time since she had crossed his threshold, the space between them did not feel transactional. It felt deliberate. When the clock chimed 11, neither moved immediately. The fourth night did not end with a contract clause or a carefully observed distance. It ended with something more dangerous than desire and more enduring than pride. It ended with understanding. And as Claire returned to her room, she realized that the real experiment unfolding within these walls was no longer about survival. It was about whether two people, shaped by different forms of scarcity, could learn to stand without armor in the same room. By the fifth night, The frozen lake beyond Whitmore Manor had begun to fracture under a brief rise in temperature. Thin cracks stretching across the ice like quiet warnings that even the strongest surfaces could not hold forever. Claire noticed the change from the west window just after dusk. Her reflection layered over the pale horizon, and she wondered whether the same invisible fractures were forming inside the man who had built his life on restraint. When she entered the conservatory at 10 o'clock, Alexander was not by the glass or the roses but seated at the long wooden table with a folder open before him, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "The doctor sent another message," he said before she could speak. "Your sister is improving. She asked when you will return." Claire felt the words settle deep in her chest, both comfort and ache intertwined. "Tell her I will come back stronger than I left," she replied softly. He studied her, as though measuring the weight behind that promise. "You speak as if this place is a trial," he observed. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Is it not?" He closed the folder and stood, moving closer with unhurried steps. "It was meant to be," he admitted. "But I am beginning to question whether I am the one being tested." The admission was quiet, but it carried more vulnerability than any declaration could have. Claire felt the shift in the room, subtle but undeniable. "Control feels safer than connection," she said. "But safety has never healed anyone." His expression changed at that. Not wounded, not defensive, simply thoughtful. Outside, a faint sound echoed from the frozen grounds, the distant crack of ice giving way under its own tension. Alexander glanced toward the window. "Everything breaks eventually," he murmured. Claire stepped beside him, close enough to share the warmth radiating from the heater, but far enough to maintain the boundary that had defined these nights. "Breaking is not the same as ending," she replied. "Sometimes it is the only way something new can breathe." He turned toward her fully then, and for the first time there was no calculation in his eyes, no evaluation of risk. There was only a question he had not yet dared to ask. "If these 30 nights end," he said carefully, "would you walk away unchanged?" Claire considered the truth. She could have offered comfort or evasion, but honesty had become the unspoken rule between them. "No," she answered, "but I will not walk away diminished either." The words settled between them with quiet strength. He reached toward the small iron heater, adjusting the flame. And in that simple movement there was a gentleness that did not belong to the man she had first met across a mahogany desk. "You do not fear me," he said, almost to himself. "I feared what I believed you represented," she corrected softly. "Power without compassion. But you are proving that power can choose differently." The statement lingered in the warm air. The conservatory felt smaller now, not confined but intimate in the safest sense of the word. When the clock struck 11, neither of them moved immediately. Outside, another soft fracture echoed across the lake. The sound neither violent nor dramatic, simply inevitable. Claire realized that. Something within Alexander Whitmore had begun to shift in much the same way, not collapsing but rearranging. And as she returned to her room beneath the steady glow of corridor lamps, she understood that the 5th night had marked a turning point. This was no longer a negotiation of survival or pride. It was the slow, deliberate dismantling of walls built long before she ever stepped into this house. On the 6th night, the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and the snow along the stone terraces began to soften at the edges, dripping steadily from the eaves like a quiet countdown. Claire noticed the change as she crossed the upper hallway, the air no longer biting at her lungs, the silence outside replaced by the faint rhythm of melting. Something was shifting beyond the walls, and she felt it within them as well. When she entered the conservatory, she found Alexander standing beside the frozen rose beds, sleeves rolled, hands resting lightly on the glass frame as if grounding himself. He did not speak immediately. He watched the last light of day fade across the fractured lake. "There will be a formal dinner tomorrow evening," he said at last, his tone composed but carrying an undercurrent she had not heard before. "Members of the estate board are arriving from the city." Claire absorbed the information slowly. "And I am to remain unseen?" she asked. He turned toward her fully. "No," he said. "You will sit beside me." The words altered the air between them. This was not a private conversation under glass and firelight. This was visibility. They will ask who I am, she said carefully. They will assume. His jaw tightened slightly. Let them assume what they wish. I am not ashamed of my decisions. Claire held his gaze. Are you certain? He stepped closer, not imposing, simply present. For the first time in years, he said quietly, I am certain of something that is not calculated. The admission was neither dramatic nor rushed. It was steady. She felt her heartbeat respond, not with fear but with awareness. Outside, a strip of ice broke free along the shoreline and drifted slowly across the dark surface of the lake. Nothing shattered. It simply separated. Your board expects an announcement soon, Claire said softly, recalling the whispers she had overheard from staff. An engagement perhaps. A shadow crossed his features. Not regret, but resistance. They expect continuity, he replied. A merger with a family whose name strengthens ours. He paused, then added. They expect predictability. Claire folded her hands before her, steady as ever. And what do you expect? The question lingered, heavier than the rest. Alexander looked at her as though measuring not her worth but his own courage. I expect honesty, he said. Even when it complicates everything. The heater hummed quietly, casting warm light over the glass panes now streaked with melting frost. Claire felt the weight of the approaching dinner, the scrutiny, the inevitable speculation. If I sit beside you, she said, I will not play a role. His gaze did not waver. I would not ask you to. The simplicity of his answer left no room for doubt. In that moment, she realized the sixth night was not about quiet confessions or fractured legacies. It was about consequence. Stepping into the public light meant relinquishing the safety of secrecy. It meant allowing the world to see what had begun within these walls. When the clock struck 11, he did not dismiss her. Instead, he offered his arm, not as a command but as a choice. She accepted, and together they walked the length of the corridor beneath portraits that no longer seemed so imposing. The house felt different, as though it too sensed the shift. Outside, the steady drip of melting snow continued, each drop marking the passage of time. Claire understood that tomorrow would change the terms of their arrangement. Visibility would test what privacy had nurtured, and as she closed the door to her room that night, she knew the sixth night had drawn a quiet line in the snow. Whatever happened next would no longer belong solely to them. The seventh night did not arrive quietly. It entered with the sound of car engines crunching over thawing gravel and headlights sweeping across the tall stone columns of Whitmore Manor. By late afternoon, 3 black sedans had lined the circular drive, and men in tailored coats stepped out into the damp air, their polished shoes skimming over melting snow. Claire watched from the upper window as staff moved with rehearsed precision, the house shifting into a formal rhythm that felt older than any single occupant. At 6 o'clock, a gown awaited her on the bed in the east wing, deep blue and understated, elegant without spectacle. She touched the fabric once, steadying her breath, understanding that visibility would demand more courage than solitude ever had. When she descended the staircase at 7:30, the great hall glowed beneath chandeliers, voices low and measured. Alexander stood near the fireplace speaking with 2 board members, his posture composed, but when he saw her, the conversation faltered almost imperceptibly. He crossed the marble floor to meet her halfway. No flourish, no display, only quiet certainty. You look prepared, he said softly. I am, she replied. He offered his arm, and she accepted, aware of every gaze that followed. The dining table stretched nearly 20 feet beneath crystal glassware and silver place settings, each seat filled with expectation. Claire sat at his right as promised. Introductions were made, names exchanged, titles mentioned. Curiosity hovered in the air like perfume. And you are? One older man finally asked, folding his napkin with deliberate care. Claire met his eyes evenly. Claire Bennett, she said. No apology, no embellishment. The silence that followed was not hostile, but it was assessing. Alexander did not rescue her from it. He did not need to. Miss Bennett has been assisting me with estate matters, he said calmly. Her perspective has proven valuable. It was not a lie, though it was not the entire truth. Dinner progressed in measured courses. Conversations circling around mergers, land values, projected expansions. Claire listened more than she spoke, But when a discussion turned toward cutting local housing initiatives to increase quarterly returns, she felt something steady rise within her. Those homes support over 50 families within a 10-mile radius, she said clearly. If they disappear, so does the labor force that sustains your supply chain. Forks paused midair. A few brows lifted. Alexander remained still beside her. Watching, profit without stability rarely endures, she added. Her voice did not waver. The older man regarded her again, this time with less dismissal. You speak confidently for someone new to these discussions, he said. Stability is not new, she replied. It is survival. The words settled heavily but not harshly. Alexander leaned back slightly, not distancing himself but allowing her space. Something like quiet approval flickered in his expression. The remainder of the dinner unfolded. With a different tone, questions directed at her were no longer veiled. They were curious. When the final course was cleared and guests rose to depart, one board member paused near Alexander. Interesting choice, he murmured. It was impossible to tell whether the comment carried warning or admiration. Once the cars disappeared beyond the gates and the house exhaled into silence, Claire stepped onto the terrace, cool air brushing her skin. Alexander joined her moments later. You did not hesitate, he said. She looked toward the dark lake where thin sheets of ice drifted apart. You asked for honesty, she answered. He studied her profile against the night sky. Tonight will have consequences, he said quietly. I know, she replied. Neither sounded afraid. The seventh night had carried their private experiment into the open, and as the last of the melted snow slid from the roof in soft, steady drops, Claire understood that something irreversible had just begun. The eighth night arrived with a different kind of silence. Not the heavy quiet of snow or the cautious hush of formal dinner, but the deliberate stillness that follows a decision already made. By morning, the effects of the previous evening had begun to ripple outward. 2 board members had requested private calls with Alexander, and the estate manager moved through the corridors with an alertness that suggested shifting alliances. Claire felt the change before anyone spoke of it. It lingered in the way staff glanced at her now, not with curiosity but with awareness. She had stepped into the light, and the light had answered. At 10 o'clock she did not wait in the conservatory. Instead, she found Alexander in his study, the mahogany desk once again between him and the world. Documents lay open in careful stacks, projections and partnership drafts arranged with precision. He looked up as she entered, and the faintest tension rested along his jaw. They were not pleased. She said quietly. No, he replied. They were not. He rose and walked around the desk, removing the barrier without comment. There is pressure for me to formalize an engagement with the Mercer family before the end of the quarter, he continued. It would secure capital and silence doubts. Claire absorbed the information without surprise. She had sensed as much. And will you? She asked. He studied her face as though the answer required more than strategy. If I do, it will be because I believe it is necessary, he said. Not because it is expected. She stepped closer, the room warm from the low fire burning in the hearth. Necessary for what? His gaze did not waver. For survival. The word echoed faintly between them, carrying a meaning far more complex than debt or land. Claire folded her hands, steady. You once said survival should not erase dignity. She reminded him. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that she was not arguing but holding him to his own standard. He moved toward the tall window overlooking the drive, where the last of the snow had receded into thin, uneven patches across the lawn. I built my life around control, he said. Tonight, I am being asked to choose between control and courage. Claire joined him at the window. The lake beyond the trees was no longer a solid mirror, but a shifting surface of dark water and drifting ice. Courage is not reckless, she said. It is deliberate. He turned toward her then, close enough that she could see the fatigue beneath his composure. If I refuse the Mercer proposal, he said quietly, there will be consequences. Investors may withdraw. Expansion plans could stall. She met his gaze steadily. And if you accept, he hesitated, then nothing changes. The simplicity of that admission carried more weight than any threat. The fire crackled softly behind them. Claire felt her heartbeat steady, not racing. You asked whether attachment can be scheduled, she said. Perhaps the better question is whether integrity can. His eyes searched hers, not for reassurance but for truth. You would stand beside me if I chose differently? He asked. She did not hesitate. I would stand beside you if you chose honestly. The distinction mattered. Outside, a gust of wind swept across the lake, breaking apart the last wide sheet of ice into scattered fragments that drifted apart without sound. Alexander exhaled, slowly, as though something within him had finally aligned. Then tomorrow, he said, I will make a decision. The eighth night did not end in certainty. It ended in resolve. And as Claire returned to her room, she understood that whatever he chose next would redefine not only the estate but the man himself. The experiment had become a reckoning, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. The ninth night did not wait for evening to announce itself. It arrived just after noon, when a silver sedan bearing the Mercer crest rolled slowly up the drive and stopped beneath the stone archway, as though it had every right to be there. Claire watched from the library window, sunlight flashing against the windshield before the engine fell silent. She did not need to be told who had come. By the time she reached the main hall, the front doors had opened and a woman stepped inside with measured grace, her coat tailored, her posture immaculate. Evelyn Mercer carried herself like someone accustomed to inevitability. Alexander met her at the threshold, composed but not warm. Their exchange was polite, practiced, almost rehearsed. Claire remained at the edge of the hall, unseen for a moment, observing the subtle distance between them. I was in the area, Evelyn said smoothly, her eyes scanning the space as though taking inventory. I thought it prudent to discuss our timeline in person. Alexander inclined his head. There is no timeline, he replied evenly. The words settled like a quiet detonation. Evelyn's smile did not falter, but something sharpened behind it. Your board believes otherwise, she said, and investors do not favor uncertainty. Claire felt the weight of the conversation shift from business to decision. Alexander glanced toward her then, not seeking permission but acknowledging presence. I have reconsidered, he said. The engagement will not proceed. The hall seemed to absorb the declaration. Evelyn's gaze followed his to Claire, and recognition flickered there, cool and calculating. Because of her? She asked, not with anger but with assessment. Alexander did not hesitate. Because of myself, he answered. I will not bind my future to a strategy that compromises my integrity. The air between them tightened, but there was no raised voice, no spectacle, only clarity. Evelyn studied him a moment longer before offering a small nod. Integrity is admirable, she said, quietly. Expensive, but admirable. She turned toward the door without further argument, her departure as controlled as her arrival. When the sedan disappeared beyond the gates, the house seemed to exhale. Claire stood very still, aware that a line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. Alexander walked toward her slowly, not triumphant, not relieved, but steady. There will be consequences, he said, the words echoing his own warning from nights before. She met his gaze without flinching. You chose deliberately, she replied. That is not recklessness. He studied her face as though searching for doubt and finding none. I expected fear, he admitted. Not from you, she said softly. Outside, the lake had fully broken free of ice, dark water moving in quiet currents that reflected the pale sky. The thaw was complete. Alexander stepped closer, not touching her, but closing the distance that had once defined every exchange. Tonight, he said, the board will demand explanations. Claire held his gaze. Then give them the truth. The simplicity of her answer steadied something within him. The ninth night did not end in secrecy or measured experiment. It ended with a choice made in daylight and owned without apology. As evening settled over Whitmore Manor, Claire understood that whatever remained of their 30 nights would no longer be about conditions or boundaries. It would be about what two people were willing to defend when the world insisted on predictability. And for the first time since she stepped through these doors, the future did not feel like a negotiation. It felt like a declaration waiting to be spoken aloud. The 10th night carried the weight of aftermath. By late afternoon, the board had gathered in the long conference room overlooking the southern grounds, their voices low but unyielding, and Claire remained in the library while Alexander faced the consequences he had promised. She did not pace. She did not attempt to overhear. Instead, she stood by the tall window, watching sunlight stretch across the newly thawed lawn, aware that decisions made in daylight often echoed louder than any private confession. Nearly 2 hours passed before the conference room doors opened. Footsteps crossed the marble floor in measured cadence. When Alexander entered the library, his expression was composed but no longer guarded. "It is done," he said simply. She turned toward him, searching not for victory but for truth. "They will reduce funding temporarily," he continued. "2 investors are withdrawing. Expansion will slow. But the housing initiative remains. The staff positions remain." Claire felt the quiet steadiness of his resolve rather than the strain behind it. "You protected what mattered," she said. He stepped closer, the fading light catching the faint lines of fatigue near his eyes. "I chose what matters," he corrected. There was no regret in his voice, only ownership. Outside, a breeze moved across the lake, now fully open water, carrying faint ripples toward the shoreline. The season had turned. "They asked about you," he added after a moment. Claire held his gaze. "And what did you say?" "That you are not a transaction," he replied. "You are a catalyst." The words settled between them. Unexpected but fitting. She exhaled slowly. "That will invite scrutiny." "It already has," he said. There was a quiet firmness in his tone, something that had not existed on the first night. This was not the man who had built walls out of calculation. This was someone willing to accept exposure. "Do you regret refusing the Mercer alliance?" she asked. He considered the question. Without deflection, "Regret implies loss," he said. "I do not feel diminished. I feel clarified." The simplicity of the statement carried more force than any declaration. Claire stepped closer, not crossing the boundary entirely, but narrowing it enough that the distance felt deliberate rather than cautious. "Then the consequences were worth it," she said. His gaze softened, though it did not waver. "There will be more," he reminded her. "Financial strain, rumors, resistance." She nodded once. "Integrity does not promise ease." Silence followed. But it was not heavy. It was shared. The library, once a space of observation, now felt like witness. "We are 10 nights in," he said quietly, almost to himself. The number lingered, no longer a countdown but a marker. Claire felt the weight of it. 10 nights that had shifted from negotiation to reckoning. "Do you still consider this an experiment?" she asked. He looked at her with something close to candor. "No," he said. "Experiments measure outcomes. This feels like commitment to a path I did not anticipate." Outside, the last strip of snow along the stone terrace slipped free and dissolved into water. The 10th night did not require dramatic gestures or whispered vows. It required presence. As the sky darkened beyond the windows and the first stars emerged over Whitmore Manor, Claire understood that what had begun as a finite arrangement had transformed into something neither contract nor condition could contain. And Alexander Whitmore stood before her not as a man protecting an image, but as one prepared to defend a choice. The 11th night arrived with rain instead of snow, steady and persistent, tracing silver lines down the tall windows of Whitmore Manor as though the sky itself were reconsidering everything it had frozen. Claire stood beneath the covered terrace just after dusk, breathing in the scent of wet stone and early spring earth, aware that the season had shifted beyond recovery. 10 nights had altered the landscape of the estate and the man who governed it. The 11th would test something quieter. When she returned inside, she found Alexander in the great hall rather than the study or conservatory. A stack of newspapers spread across the long oak table. Headlines speculated on his refusal of the Mercer alliance, some measured, others less charitable. He did not attempt to conceal them. "They prefer certainty," he said as she approached. "And certainty is easier to market than principle." Claire glanced at the bold print without flinching. "Public doubt does not erase private clarity," she replied. He watched her carefully, searching for hesitation that did not appear. "You are aware that your name may soon circulate with mine," he said. Not kindly. She met his gaze evenly. "My life has never depended on kindness from strangers." The answer did not carry defiance. It carried fact. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, not violent, merely present. Alexander gathered the papers into a single stack and set them aside. I expected you to ask when this ends, he said quietly. She understood the unspoken reference to the 30 nights that had once defined every boundary. I have been counting, she admitted, but not in the way you intended. He stepped closer, rainlight, reflecting faintly in his eyes. And how have you been counting? Indecisions, she said. In moments where you could have retreated and did not. The words settled between them with gentle weight. He studied her as though recalibrating his own understanding. The board will meet again in 2 weeks, he said. They will demand proof that my choice was not reckless. Claire felt the inevitability of scrutiny, but not its threat. Then show them results, she answered. Stability, growth, community support. Integrity has its own return on investment. A faint curve touched his mouth at the unexpected language. You have adapted quickly, he observed. She shook her head slightly. I have always understood survival. I am simply applying it differently. Thunder sounded again, closer now, and rain intensified against the windows. The storm did not frighten her. It clarified the air. Alexander moved toward the fireplace, adjusting the flame until warmth filled the hall. I once believed power meant standing alone, he said, voice low but steady. Now I am beginning to suspect it means choosing who stands with you. Claire felt the significance of the admission. This was no longer about debt or arrangement. It was about alignment. Standing with someone is not surrender, she said. It is partnership. The word lingered in the glow of firelight. He turned toward her fully, not imposing, not distant, simply present. And if partnership outlasts our agreement, he asked. She held his gaze without wavering. Then it was never an agreement. It was a beginning. Silence followed. But it was not uncertain. It was deliberate. Outside, rain washed the last traces of winter from the stone steps. Inside, something equally definitive settled into place. The 11th night did not require dramatic declarations. It required recognition. And as thunder faded into a steady rhythm of rain, Claire understood that whatever time remained in their counted nights, the choice to stand together had already been made. The 12th night unfolded beneath a sky finally clear of rain. The air crisp, but no longer unforgiving, as though the world itself had chosen to steady after the storm. Whitmore Manor stood quiet against the dark horizon, its windows glowing with restrained warmth. Claire had spent the day reviewing estate reports at Alexander's request, not as a guest, but as a participant, tracing numbers that now felt less abstract and more consequential. Stability was no longer theoretical. It was measurable in families housed, wages sustained, futures protected. When evening settled, she found him in the south garden rather than inside, standing beside the stone balustrade overlooking the lake. The water reflected the first full moon of the season, bright and unwavering. The investors reconsidered, he said as she approached. Not all of them, but enough. She waited, sensing that the detail mattered. They saw the housing initiative as a long-term asset rather than a liability. He continued, community loyalty translates into measurable growth. A faint smile touched her lips. Integrity has its own return on investment, she reminded him gently. He turned toward her, and for a moment there was no tension in his posture, only clarity. You were correct, he said. The decision was not reckless. It was aligned. The word lingered between them like a quiet confirmation. A breeze moved through the garden, carrying the faint scent of thawed earth and early blossoms. We are nearing the midpoint, he added after a pause. She understood the reference without needing the number spoken aloud. Time had shifted from countdown to transformation. And what do you intend to do with the remaining nights? She asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the edge of the terrace, looking out across the water that no longer carried ice. I intended to maintain distance, he admitted, to ensure that when this ended, neither of us would be altered beyond recognition. She studied his profile in the moonlight. And now, he exhaled slowly. Now I am no longer certain that distance serves either of us. The honesty was neither impulsive nor dramatic. It was deliberate. Claire felt the weight of it settle within her, steady rather than overwhelming. Distance was protection, she said softly. But protection is not the same as connection. He looked at her fully then, and there was no hesitation in his gaze. If I asked you to remain beyond what was agreed, he said quietly, would you consider it? The question carried no demand, only vulnerability. She held his eyes without flinching. "I would consider it if it is no longer a bargain," she replied. "If it is a choice made freely." Silence followed. But it was not uncertain. It was aware. The 12th night did not end with a dramatic vow or sweeping gesture. It ended with recognition that the boundaries once drawn by necessity had softened into something chosen. As the moonlight traced silver across the lake and the garden breathed with new life, Claire understood that whatever remained of their numbered nights would not define them. The decision had already begun to take shape, not an obligation, but an intention. The 13th night did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived with sunrise. For the first time since Claire Bennet stepped through the iron gates of Whitmore Manor, the sky over the estate held no trace of winter. Only a clear expanse of pale blue stretching wide and unburdened. The lake shimmered in early light, fully thawed, no fragments drifting, no fractures visible. Transformation had completed its quiet work. Claire stood at the terrace overlooking the grounds, the morning air cool against her skin, aware that something had reached its natural conclusion. Footsteps sounded behind her, steady and unhurried. Alexander Whitmore joined her without announcement, his presence familiar now in a way that did not require permission. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them was no longer guarded. It was shared. "We began this with a condition," he said at last, his voice calm but deliberate. 30 nights. A boundary, an end date. Claire nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon. "And we are closer to the end than the beginning," she replied. There was no tremor in her voice. He stepped beside her, close enough that the distance felt chosen rather than measured. "I built that condition to protect myself," he admitted. "I believed that structure would prevent attachment from becoming dependency. I was wrong." She turned toward him fully. There was no surprise in her expression, only clarity. "You were not protecting yourself," she said softly. "You were protecting control." The truth did not wound. It aligned. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing the last remnant of something outdated. "Control is predictable," he said. "Connection is not. But I no longer want predictable." The statement carried no dramatics. It carried decision. The estate behind them was quiet, staff moving through routine, unaware that the foundation of their leadership was being rewritten. "When I asked if you would consider remaining beyond what was agreed," he continued, "I was still thinking in terms of permission. I am not asking for an extension. I am asking for partnership." The words settled into the morning air with steady weight. Claire studied him, not searching for doubt, but for intent. "Partnership is not shelter," she said. "It is shared responsibility." He met her gaze without hesitation. "Then stand with me not because you must, but because you choose to." The lake reflected the sun in quiet brilliance, light stretching across the water without resistance. Claire felt the truth of her own answer before she spoke it. "I do not remain out of obligation," she said. "I remain because what we built here is deliberate." A faint smile touched his expression, not triumphant, but relieved. "Then the 30 nights were never a transaction," he said. "They were a threshold." She nodded once. The 13th night did not close a chapter. It opened one. No contract lay between them now, no measured agreement. Only intention. Alexander extended his hand, not as command, not as condition, but as invitation. Claire placed hers in his. The gesture was simple, almost quiet, yet it carried more certainty than any clause ever could. The manor stood behind them, no longer a place of experiment, but of choice. And as the morning light strengthened over Whitmore Manor, it was clear that destiny had not been purchased or negotiated. It had been changed by two people who chose integrity over control and partnership over fear.